The morning after the worst storm in a decade arrived without ceremony. No golden light, no slow thaw, no merciful pause between the suffering and the reckoning. Just gray pressing through the smoke hole of the roundstone cabin, and a cold so complete it felt less like weather than like something with intention, the kind of cold that finds every weak joint, every gap, every place where two materials meet imperfectly and presses until something gives. Three families in Bitterroot Valley had burned through more than a cord of wood each in the last 72 hours. One family had lost their barn roof to the snow load, the cedar planks cracking through the night, in a sound their children would describe for years as the house screaming. The Pierce family, an older man, his wife, and their two grandchildren, had spent the second night of the blizzard huddled in borrowed blankets inside a neighbor's home. Their own cabin too cold to sustain a fire that could compete with the wind driving through the log seams at 40 miles an hour. Across the valley floor, the chimney smoked with a kind of desperation, gray columns bending hard south in the residual gusts, each one a measure of how much fuel had already been consumed and how much more still had to burn before spring gave anyone permission to stop worrying. There was one chimney that did not bend, one column of smoke that rose thin and steady from a structure that looked in the flat white light of that December morning like something that had no business being there, a low round shape of riverstone and lime mortar, perhaps 12 feet across, sitting at the edge of a half-cleared lot with the settled calm of something very old and very certain. The smoke from its center peak was not the thick, urgent gray of a fire being pushed hard. It was pale, almost translucent, the exhaust of a fire that had been asked to do only what it was built to do and nothing more. A man named Owen Reeves, walking through thigh-deep snow toward the general store that morning, stopped when he saw it. He stood there long enough for the cold to work into his fingers through his gloves, staring at that thin column and at the absence of frantic movement around it. No one splitting emergency wood, no one hauling buckets of water to manage a fire burning too hot, no sounds of a household in the grip of crisis. Just the smoke, just the stone, just the stillness of a structure that had been built to hold. He could not have known, standing there that 14 months earlier, the man who built that cabin had been standing in a cabin not so different from his own, watching his daughter stop breathing right. Pull back 14 months. Pull back to the winter of 1878 before the foundation was laid, before the first stone was selected from the riverbed, before anyone in Bitterroot Valley had a reason to form an opinion about the shape of a building. Pull back to the night Elias Morrow understood with the specific and unmerciful clarity that only a father in a cold room at 2 in the morning can understand that the way things had always been done was going to kill someone he loved. Nora was 8 years old and small for her age, with her mother's serious eyes and a habit of collecting interesting rocks in her coat pockets that had amused Elias since she could walk. She had been coughing for 3 days when the temperature dropped to 17 below, and by the fourth day the cough had moved from her throat into her chest, settling there with the heavy wet sound of something that had found a home it intended to keep. Dr. Aldous Cray, who served the valley out of a converted room in his house on the north end, came at first light on the 5th day and stood in the corner of the Morrow cabin with his face arranged in the careful, neutral expression of a man delivering information he wishes he did not have to deliver. The floor was cold under his boots, always cold in these log cabins, no matter how hard the fire burned, because heat rises and the gap between the raised foundation and the frozen ground below created a channel of moving air that kept the floor perpetually 10 degrees colder than the room above it. He had seen this pattern before. He would say what he had to say. The cold settles in the corners, he told Elias, not as diagnosis, but as fact, the kind of fact that a man who has watched children sicken through many Montana winters simply accumulates and carries with him. Cold air pools in the low places in the corners under the beds. The floor stays cold no matter what you burn. She's been breathing that air for weeks. He paused, looking at the child in the bed, her chest moving with that particular labored rhythm that made the silence between breaths feel like a held question. She needs warmth from below, not just above. She needs air that moves evenly, not air that pools and sits. Elias stood at the foot of his daughter's bed that night and did not sleep. He fed the fire in intervals, watching it push heat upward toward the log ceiling, while the floor under his feet stayed cold enough to ache through his wool socks. He watched the corners of the room where shadows gathered and air settled and refused to circulate. He watched the gaps between the logs, where the dried chinking had shrunk over the winter, each one a small wound in the wall through which the night was slowly bleeding in. He had built this cabin himself 3 years earlier, following the same pattern every man in the valley followed, because it was the pattern that had always worked, which meant it was the pattern that had kept people alive enough to complain about, but not alive enough to stop complaining. He was a stonemason by training, not a carpenter. He had built the cabin because he had to, and because the lumber was available, and because that was what you built in Montana in 1875 if you wanted shelter before the first hard freeze. But he had never stopped being a stonemason in the way that a man never stops being whatever it is that shaped him most completely in his youth. He had learned his trade in Pennsylvania under a man named Virgil Hoback, who had spent 40 years building foundations for mills and granaries and the occasional ambitious farmhouse, and who believed with a conviction that bordered on religious that no material on earth stored heat the way dense stone did. Stone was patient, Hoback used to say. Stone received what you gave it and held it longer than you deserved. He had shown the young Elias how the thick stone walls of a mill they were repairing stayed warm to the touch, 2 days after the furnace had been cold, radiating heat into the space around them from some deep reservoir that seemed to have nothing to do with the fire that had originally charged it. He had shown him the difference between limestone and sandstone and granite in terms of their specific capacity to absorb and release. Granite held more but took longer to charge. Sandstone was faster but gave up its heat in 6 hours rather than 12. Dense riverstone fell somewhere useful in between. This was not mysticism. It was physics that a working stonemason learned through his hands before he learned it through any book. Standing at Nora's bedside, Elias ran the numbers in his head the way a man does when he cannot sleep, and his mind defaults to the machinery of the thing it knows best. A standard log cabin like his own 16 by 20 feet contained perhaps 300 pounds of material with any meaningful thermal mass, the stone fireplace and chimney. Everything else was wood, which insulated but did not store. The fire heated the air. The air leaked through the chinking and the floor gap and the door seams, and by morning there was nothing left but cold and ash and the task of starting over. You were burning firewood to heat the air, and the air was leaving as fast as you could make it warm. Every night was a race you could not win. What if the walls themselves were the battery? He did not write this down that night. He turned it over in his mind, the way he had learned to turn over structural problems from every angle, looking for the failure point, the place where the logic cracked. Dense stone walls thick enough to absorb a full day's heat and hold it through the long Montana night. But how thick and in what shape? This was the question that had kept him awake, not with anxiety, but with the focused attention of a man who has found the problem worth solving. A square building had corners, 4 of them, each one a structural join, where logs met imperfectly, where heat did not circulate, where cold air settled and stayed. He had watched the corners of his own cabin ice over on the worst nights, the frost forming on the interior logs in the angle where 2 walls met, and the convection could not reach. The geometry of a square fought the geometry of moving air. Heat wanted to travel in arcs. Corners interrupted arcs. Corners were in the most literal physical sense where warmth went to die. A circle had no corners. He had not arrived at this conclusion with any sense of discovery because it was not new. He had read about it in a catalog of architectural principles that a Philadelphia engineer had published in 1871, a thin volume he had borrowed from the surveyor's office and never fully returned, which now lived in a box under the bed where Nora lay breathing her careful, labored breaths. The catalog cited structures that predated anything in the American West by 2,000 years, circular forms that had been used precisely because the geometry supported heat distribution, structural integrity, and the natural circulation of air. The catalog did not romanticize this. It described it as engineering, which was the only language Elias trusted completely. Nora recovered. It took 3 weeks and the careful attention of Clara, who had grown up watching her father practice medicine in rural Ohio, and who understood the relationship between cold environments and respiratory illness with a practicality that had nothing to do with sentimentality. Clara had kept warm compresses on Nora's chest and kept her in the center of the room away from the corners, and had burned more wood in those 3 weeks than they usually burned in a month, nursing the fire like something alive that required constant tending. When the fever finally broke and Nora asked for water and her eyes came back into focus with the particular alertness of a child who has been very sick and is now very hungry, Clara sat down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands for a long moment. Not crying, just absorbing the fact that the outcome had gone the right way this time. Elias told her his plan that same night. Not as a proposal, not as something he was considering, as a statement of what was going to happen. Clara listened without interrupting, which was how she engaged with information. She was taking seriously. She went very still and very focused, and her eyes moved in the particular way they moved when she was processing something rather than simply hearing it. When he finished, she asked three questions. How thick would the walls need to be to hold enough mass? How long to build before the next winter? And how certain was he that the shape would stay structurally sound through a frost heave cycle? These were the right questions, and he had answers for the first two and a working hypothesis for the third. The third one was the question that would matter most in the months ahead, because it was the one that everyone else in the valley would ask loudly and repeatedly, as if structural failure were the obvious and inevitable outcome of building anything in a shape that had not been built in Bitterroot Valley before. But that night, alone with his wife, in a warm enough cabin with their daughter finally sleeping, without the wet chest sound, the third question felt like something that could be answered with work and time and careful attention to the mortar ratios. Clara nodded slowly when he finished explaining. Then we start in August, she said, when the ground is dry enough to lay a foundation and the river is low enough to pull good stone. August came and Elias went to the river. He went alone in the hour before the valley woke in the flat gray light, before the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline. He wore heavy gloves and carried an iron rod for testing, tapping the submerged stones to hear the tone of their density, the hollow tap of a porous rock versus the clean ring of dense granite or sandstone that had spent decades under moving water being compressed and smoothed. He was not in a hurry. Hurrying at this stage was the way you ended up with walls that looked right, but absorbed heat, the way a dry sponge absorbed water quickly, and then not at all. The river gave up its stones reluctantly, the way good things are always reluctant. He pulled each candidate from the shallows and held it in both hands, feeling its weight reading its surface for the fracture lines and air pockets that meant a stone would crack under thermal expansion, would fail under load, would betray him in February when he needed it most. Most stones he put back. The ones he kept he stacked on the bank in a growing line, heads of granite and dense sandstone, each piece the approximate size of a man's skull. Each piece a future reservoir for heat that would not be needed for another 5 months, but that he could already imagine radiating from walls that had not yet been built, warming a floor that did not yet exist, keeping his daughter breathing easy through the next worst night the valley could produce. He sorted them by shape as he pulled them, a practice Virgil Hoback had drilled into him so thoroughly that it was reflex now rather than method. The flatter pieces for the base courses, where stability mattered most. The more irregular pieces for the mid-wall, where the mortar could fill the gaps and the mass of accumulated weight would hold everything in compression. He was building the wall in his mind, even as he selected the material for it, which was what it meant to have spent 20 years thinking in stone. Franklin Holt saw him there one morning in late August, coming around the river bend, on his way to assess a property on the west side of the valley where he was contracted to build a cabin before October. Holt was 53 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had built more structures than anyone in the valley and knew it. He had come west from Ohio 15 years earlier with a carpenter's training and a builder's eye, and had slowly, methodically established himself as the man you asked if you wanted something built right. He had put up 22 cabins in the valley, every one of them rectangular, every one of them using the tried methods that had sheltered families through Montana winters for 2 decades. He stopped on the bank and watched Elias testing stones for a long moment before speaking. You're pulling enough stone there for a foundation and half a wall. And the observation was neutral in tone, the kind of thing a builder says to another builder as a way of asking a question without asking a question. Elias kept working. Foundation and the whole wall, he replied. I'm going round. Holt was quiet for longer than a comfortable silence warranted, and Elias, who had been watching men respond to this information in his head for months, did not turn around. He heard the quality of the silence, not surprise, exactly more like recognition, the sound a man makes when he has been handed information that lands in a place that already had a shape for it. Round, Holt said finally. That's a lot of stone. It is. Elias straightened it and looked at him for the first time. Dense riverstone granite where I can find it. Walls 2 feet thick at the base, 18 inches at the roof line. Central chimney, conical roof. Holt's expression did not change. He looked at the line of selected stones on the bank. Then he nodded once and walked on. What Elias did not know, could not have known, was that Franklin Holt owned a copy of the same Philadelphia engineering catalog, had owned it for 4 years, had read the sections on circular structures and thermal mass with the concentrated attention of a man who understood exactly what he was reading, had spent 3 evenings with the catalog open on his table, working through the math, arriving at the same conclusion Elias had arrived at, that a circular stone structure of sufficient mass could in theory reduce firewood consumption by more than half and maintain interior temperatures that no log cabin in the valley could match. He had not built one. He had read the catalog, understood the principle, and gone back to building rectangular log cabins, because that was what people in Bitterroot Valley paid him to build, and because suggesting something radically different would have meant suggesting that every cabin he had already built was worse than it could have been. Which it was, he knew it was. But knowing a thing and being willing to act on it in front of the people whose trust you have spent 15 years earning are two different calculations. And Holt had made his calculation and put the catalog back on the shelf. He had never told anyone about the catalog. The foundation went in during the first 2 weeks of September, a perfect circle sunk 2 feet into the frost line. Each course of stone set with lime mortar, mixed to Hoback's ratios from memory, 1 part lime to 3 parts sharp sand, with enough water to reach the consistency of thick cream, but not so much that the mortar slumped before it set. Elias worked alone in the mornings and with Henry in the late afternoons, his son learning to mix by feel, rather than measurement the way Elias himself had learned, developing the instinct in his hands for when the batch was right. Henry was curious in the way of children who have been raised by people who explain things, and he asked questions constantly. Why this stone here instead of that one? Why the circle instead of a square? Why lime instead of clay? Elias answered every question fully, not because he thought Henry would retain the technical specifics, but because he believed in the way that certain fathers believe that being taken seriously by a parent is itself the education. The walls began rising in the last week of September, and that was when the valley began to watch. It started with casual observation. Men passing on the road slowing their horses to look. Women in the general store mentioning it with the particular tone that attaches itself to things that are unusual but not yet threatening. Walt Taggart, a trapper who had spent 15 winters in the valley and survived them all through a combination of experience and thick wool, stopped by on a Tuesday morning and stood at the edge of the property with his arms folded, studying the rising curve of stone with the expression of a man diagnosing something. Round walls, he said to no one in particular, though Elias was within easy hearing. You're going to get smoke behavior you didn't plan for. Warm air can't find a corner to break against. It'll pull wrong circle back down and you'll wake up dead. Elias set a stone in place and checked the level without looking up. I'm venting through the peak. Conical roof, open chimney, natural draft. Warm air rises through center, fresh air draws in at the door gap. Complete exchange every 40 minutes without significant heat loss. Taggart chewed on the side of his cheek. That's theory. So is everything until it isn't, Elias said, and reached for another stone. The technical objections were manageable. The personal ones were harder to absorb without feeling them in the chest. A farmer named Doyle, whose property bordered the Morrow lot on the south side, made a point of discussing the project loudly at the general store on the first Saturday of October, in the hearing of as many people as he could arrange. He announced seen some unusual construction choices in his years in Montana, but a man building a grain silo to house his family was a new category entirely. There was laughter, the specific laughter of a crowd that is not entirely sure it agrees, but finds it easier to laugh than to think. Someone asked what he would do if the mortar cracked in the first freeze. Someone else asked where you hung tools on a curved wall. A woman whose name Elias never learned expressed sincere sympathy for Clara, who had gone along with this, the implication being that a sensible woman would not have gone along with it, which revealed more about the speaker's understanding of Clara than about any structural principle. Henry came home on a Thursday afternoon with a split lower lip and said nothing about it until Clara sat with him at the table that evening and waited with the patient, undemanding silence that children eventually cannot resist filling. They said we live in a bread oven, he told her, looking at the table. They said when winter comes, we'll freeze and Dad will have to burn the furniture. Clara looked at her son for a long moment at the bruise forming under his lip and the particular set of his jaw that was a copy of Elias's jaw when he was working through something he did not want to show. She did not tell him the other children were wrong because she believed that telling children the outcome before they had seen it for themselves was a shortcut that cost them something important. Instead, she said, a circle has no weak points, and let him work out what that meant. Elias found out about the fight from Clara and came to Henry in the yard before supper, where the boy was stacking the smaller stones left over from the day's work into a low practice wall of his own design. Elias crouched down to his son's eye level in the way that adults do when they want a conversation to happen between equals, rather than between a tall person and a short one. He looked at the bruised lip and then at the practice wall and then at his son's face. The men who built the first suspension bridges in this country, he said, were laughed at every day they worked. The men who built the first iron bridges were told by every carpenter alive that iron couldn't hold. Not one of those bridges fell because someone laughed at them. Henry was quiet, arranging a flat stone on top of his practice wall with careful attention. What if it does fall? Elias picked up a stone and handed it to his son. Then we build again, and we learn why, and the second one doesn't fall. They worked side by side in the cooling evening until Clara called them in, and the question did not come up again. Holt's visit in early October was the one that cost Elias the most to absorb without letting it show. The older builder came during working hours, which meant it was not a social call. He walked the perimeter of the rising wall with the slow, methodical attention of someone performing a structural assessment rather than an opinion. His boots crunched on the frost. He tapped sections of the wall with one knuckle, listening. He crouched to examine the base courses where the mortar had already cured. Elias watched him from across the circle, setting stones in the upper course, waiting. Holt finished his circuit and stood with his hands in his coat pockets. And the thing about Holt was that he was not a cruel man, and he was not a stupid man, and the combination of those two facts made what he said next more complicated than cruelty or stupidity would have been. The load-bearing curve has worked in arch construction, Holt said, and there was something in his voice, a flatness, a deliberate compression of affect that Elias would think about later and understand more fully. But a full circle is different than an arch. The inward thrust of a complete circle under roof load, and at this height, with this mortar, you're counting on the compression holding all the way around. One section fails, the whole thing fails. Elias kept working. A circle is the most compression-stable shape there is, he said. The arch is a slice of a circle. Every section of this wall is already an arch. The failure mode you're describing is a failure mode for a flat wall, not for a closed curve. Holt's jaw moved slightly, the way it moved when he was processing something he did not want to visibly process. I've put up 24 cabins, he said. Not one of them fell. I know, Elias said. This one won't either. The silence between them lasted long enough to have content, and then Holt turned and walked back toward the road without saying anything more. He did not look back. That night, after the fire was banked and the children were asleep, and the cabin was as warm as it was going to get, which was not warm enough, Clara sat across from Elias at the table with the engineering catalog open between them. She had been reading the sections on thermal capacity with the focused, quiet attention she brought to her father's medical text, not deferring to the authority of the page, but engaging with it, testing it against what she already knew. Her father had treated pneumonia in rural Ohio for 30 years. He had told her more than once that a warm floor mattered more than a warm ceiling, that still cold air was more dangerous to a sick child than moving cold air, that the reason stone farmhouses in Pennsylvania had fewer winter respiratory cases than log cabins was a question of surface temperature, of radiant heat versus convective heat, of the difference between a room where the walls were part of the heating system and a room where the walls were simply the border of the cold. She had not needed the catalog to believe in the principle. She had needed to see whether Elias's numbers were right. At 20 degrees of heat stored per pound, she said, tapping the page where he had worked his figures, and 4,000 pounds of wall, that's 80,000 degree pounds of stored capacity. Roughly 16,000 BTU, Elias said. if I can raise the average wall temperature by 20 degrees over a day's fire, which takes how long to achieve? He looked at the ceiling, running the math he had run many times before. 3 to 4 days of consistent firing starting from cold. After that, the walls maintain. You're not charging them from scratch every day, you're topping them off. Clara was quiet, and in her quietness was something that looked from the outside like reservation but was actually concentration. The door gap for air exchange, she said. Will it be enough if we have guests? The question surprised him, not its practicality, which was characteristic of Clara, but its specificity. He had not yet thought about guests. Why guests? She looked at him with the direct, unsentimental gaze she had developed from years of watching her father deliver bad news kindly. Because if the worst storm I've ever seen comes through this valley and our walls hold and someone's roof doesn't, they will knock on our door, and we should know whether we can let them in. He thought about this for a long time. I'll make the smoke hole adjustable, he said finally, so we can open it further if we need more air exchange for more bodies. She nodded and closed the catalog. It was the most complete conversation they had ever had about a building, which meant it was the most complete conversation they had ever had about the future. The walls reached their full height of 7 feet in the first week of November. The conical roof went on in sections over 5 days, rough-cut pine beams radiating from a central iron hub, like wheel spokes covered with overlapping cedar shakes that had been cut with enough overhang at the base to shed the snow load away from the wall line rather than letting it pile against the stone. The smoke hole at the peak was fitted with a pivoting iron cap that Elias had traded 2 days of foundation work for, able to be open wide or nearly closed depending on the draft conditions and the number of people in the cabin. The door was hung on the south-facing side, set at a slight angle to the prevailing north wind, so that opening it would not drive cold air directly across the interior floor. These were not decorative choices. Every one of them was the result of a structural logic that had been worked through in advance and then worked through again. They moved in on November 18th. Clara stood in the doorway with a blanket over her shoulders and her arms full of the children's winter quilts. And the first thing she said was not about the size, which was smaller than their previous cabin, or the shape, which was unlike anything she had lived in before. The first thing she said was, "It's already warm in here." This was true. The mortar had been curing for weeks, and the curing process released heat, and the stone had been absorbing what ambient warmth there was in the mild fall days. The interior sat at 52 degrees before a single log had been burned inside it, and 52 degrees in Montana in November felt, after weeks of sleeping in a drafty log cabin, like something close to grace. Elias said it would be warmer by morning, and by the end of the week, she would not remember what cold floors felt like. The thermometer went up on the interior wall 3 days after they moved in a mercury instrument that Clara had purchased at the general store, the kind used to track temperatures in a physician's examination room, accurate to within 1 degree. Elias hung it at standing height on the east side of the interior curve, where it would register the ambient air temperature without being directly influenced by the fire. This was Clara's idea. She understood with the instinct of someone raised near careful measurement that a claim without a number was an opinion, and an opinion in this valley was worth about as much as a fresh crack in winter mortar. The number on the thermometer was the thing that would matter. Everything else was noise. It was cold 2 days later, 14 degrees Fahrenheit, with a north wind that found the gaps in every log cabin in the valley and did what north wind in Montana always did, which was to find the gap and make it wider. Elias fed the fire in the morning, with a half-cord split of dry pine, burning it hot for 3 hours to push heat into the walls, then letting it fall to coals while he went out to check the mortar joints in the roof overlap and the door seal. The thermometer read 61 degrees when he came back inside. The fire was coals. The walls were warm to the touch along every section of the interior curve. Outside, the temperature was still falling. He stood for a long moment with his hand flat against the stone, feeling the heat radiating out of it with a steadiness that was nothing like the uneven throb of a roaring fire, and everything like a body that has been holding warmth all day and is now giving it back. He had built this. He had calculated this. But there was a difference he was learning between understanding a thing in theory and feeling it radiate against your palm on a 14-degree night in November, and the difference had a quality to it that was less triumph than relief. The particular relief of a man who has bet what he could not afford to lose and found out the bet was sound. He heard Nora's voice from the far side of the cabin reading aloud to her brother from one of the books they had brought from Pennsylvania, her voice clear and uninterrupted by coughing, her breath moving freely in warm air. He did not turn around. Then in the middle of checking the mortar along the lower north section, he found it. A hairline fracture in the joint between two base course stones. Not a structural failure, not even a failure at all. In the technical sense, just the natural result of a slight variation in the mortar mix that had left one joint marginally drier than the others. He knew immediately what had caused it, and he knew immediately how to fix it, and he also knew that if anyone in the valley saw it before he fixed it, the fact of the crack would travel through the community at the speed of any bad news, which was faster than the speed of anything good. He looked up from the crack. Franklin Holt was standing at the property gate in the last light of the evening, watching him, not approaching, not calling out. Just standing there at the edge of the lot with his coat collar up and his hands in his pockets, looking at the round stone shawl with an expression that the failing light made impossible to read fully, though there was something in the angle of his head, some quality of attention that was not hostile and not friendly and not neutral either, but something more precise than any of those, the look of a man who is watching something very carefully because he is not yet certain what he is watching. The two men looked at each other across the 30 feet of frozen ground. Then Holt turned and walked back toward the road, and the valley closed over him, and the thermometer on the interior wall read 63 degrees, and somewhere in the walls 4,000 pounds of stone were holding their heat against the coming night. The crack did not stay private for even one full day. Elias had found it in the failing light of an evening in mid-November, a hairline fracture running 3 inches through the mortar joint between two base course stones on the north face, thin as a pencil line, but visible to anyone who looked, which meant visible to anyone who walked past the property with any interest in finding something wrong. He had not repaired it that night because the temperature had dropped too fast for fresh mortar to cure before it froze, which would have made the repair worse than the original fault. He had covered the section with a canvas tarp weighted at the corners with stones and told himself that by morning he would have the temperature window he needed. By morning, 3 men had already been by. The first was a neighbor named Greer, whose property backed up against the north side of the lot, a quiet man who had said almost nothing about the construction all fall and who now stood at the edge of the tarp with his hat in his hands and a look of uncertain sympathy on his face, the look people wear when they are sorry but also not entirely surprised. The second was Taggart, who had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of development, with the patience of a man who has nothing to lose by being right. He did not come to the property. He went to the general store, which amounted to the same thing, and achieved more. By noon, the story had gained a detail it did not originally have. The crack was in the structural wall. Some version of the story claimed not just the mortar joint, the stone itself had split. By mid-afternoon, the detail had grown further, as details do, in small communities with long winters and limited other entertainment. Elias Morrow had found 3 cracks, or 5, and they were spreading. He heard the inflated version from Owen Reeves, who stopped by in the early afternoon with the plain-spoken directness of a man who prefers to deal with things accurately rather than let them compound. "People are saying the north wall is cracked through," Reeves said. He stood at the edge of the property looking at the tarp, his breath fogging in the cold. "I can see from here that's a mortar joint and not a structural failure, but I'm not the one you need to convince." Elias pulled back the tarp and crouched beside the section, running his finger along the hairline fracture with the attention of a man reading a fault. He had already identified the cause, a single batch of mortar mixed in late September when the sand supply had run low, and he had substituted a coarser aggregate that did not compact the same way in the joint, leaving a slightly higher void ratio that had compressed under the first hard freeze. One joint in several hundred, but one was enough for the story to grow around. What he needed was a 48-hour window of temperatures above 28 degrees to allow fresh mortar to cure before the next hard cold arrived. The forecast, as far as anyone could read it from the sky and the wind behavior and the way the horses were standing in the field, suggested that window was closing. He had perhaps 2 days before the next cold snap dropped below the curing threshold and locked him out of any repair that would hold. He mixed a new batch of that afternoon, adjusting the ratio to a finer aggregate and increasing the lime fraction to give the mixture more flexibility in the joint, a formula he had used on a mill foundation in Pennsylvania that had survived 30 winters without a failure that he knew of. He worked the failed joint with a chisel, clearing the fractured mortar to a clean edge before packing the new mixture and tamping it with a narrow iron rod to eliminate air voids, running a wet finger along the surface to close the face. Then he moved to the two other joints he had identified as candidates for the same failure mode, not cracked yet, but mixed from the same late September batch carrying the same risk. He repacked both of them before the temperature dropped at dusk. It was on the second morning of this work that he found the note. It was folded once and tucked under the edge of the canvas tarp at the north wall corner, weighted by a stone so that it would not blow away in the night, but positioned so that only someone lifting the tarp would find it. He unfolded it with gloved hands, the paper stiff with cold, and read it in the flat morning light. It contained 3 lines in a handwriting he recognized from the Valley's land survey records, where Holt had witnessed several property transactions, and signed his name in the same careful compressed script, a script that belonged to a man who had learned to write at school and had never developed any flourishes because flourishes were not useful. The lines read 1 part lime, 2.5 parts fine river sand, 1/10 part ox hair for flex and thermal cycling. Mix wet, not dry. It holds to -30 if set above 28. No signature, no explanation, no indication of how it had come to be under the tarp in the night. Elias read it twice, then folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He stood for a moment looking at the north wall, at the repaired joints he had worked yesterday, at the sound stone above them that had given no indication of any problem and continued to give no indication of any problem. He thought about Holt walking the perimeter of this wall in October with his knuckle tapping and his careful circuit, and about the quality of silence that had preceded his comment about load-bearing curves, the flatness, the compression, and he began to understand that the silence had been the sound of a man making an effort. Not the effort of a man who didn't know, the effort of a man who did know and had decided on something and was applying himself to it with discipline. He mixed the third batch using the note's ratios. The ox hair he sourced from the tack shed, pulling it from an old brush, with enough fiber to add the tensile flexibility the formula called for. The mix came together differently than his previous batches, smoother, denser, with a surface sheen after tamping. That indicated the finer aggregate was packing correctly at the molecular level, filling the voids that the coarser sand had left. He worked through the afternoon with Henry beside him, the boy learning the new ratio by feel rather than measurement, his hands in the mix up to the wrists, developing the instinct that his father had spent 20 years developing and that could not be taught any other way. Clara brought them food at midday and stood watching for a few minutes with her hands wrapped around a tin cup. She had seen the note Elias had shown her without commentary, and she had held it for a long time before handing it back. "He knows the right ratio," she said finally. Her voice carried the measured quality of someone working through a conclusion that has more layers than it appears to. "He's known it for a while." Elias kept mixing. "He knows a lot of things." The pause that followed had the weight of a shared understanding that neither of them needed to speak further. Clara went back inside. The temperature held above freezing for 36 more hours, just long enough for the new mortar to pass its critical cure window. On the second night, Elias stayed up until midnight, checking the joints with a lamp, pressing his thumb against the surfaces to test the set, looking for the particular resistance that meant the lime had begun its chemical bond with the stone. It was there. By morning, when the temperature dropped hard to 12 degrees and the ground cracked with the sound of earth contracting around frozen moisture, the joints held. Not one failure. The entire north wall repacked with the formula from a note left by a man who had publicly predicted the cabin's structural demise, held solid through a temperature swing that had opened previous mortar to hairline fractures. Life inside the completed cabin settled into a rhythm that had its own internal logic. Elias built the morning fire, hot dry pine split thin, stacked for maximum surface area, burning with the focused intensity of a fire being asked to do specific work rather than simply burn. The goal was not ambient air temperature. The goal was wall temperature. He wanted the stone absorbing energy during the 3-hour burn window, pulling heat into its mass the way a cistern pulls water, not taking it all at once, but building a reserve that could be drawn on slowly across the next 16 hours. Clara kept the interior organized with the practical ingenuity of someone who had thought carefully about how to live in a circular space, the curved shelves she had shaped from bent green pine following the wall contour, the central table positioned so that the walking path around it remained clear, regardless of how many people needed to move at once. The beds positioned against the east and west sections of the wall, where the stone radiated the most consistent temperature through the night. Nora had chosen her sleeping position against the east wall and defended it with the territorial conviction of a child who has experienced one respiratory illness and has no interest in experiencing another. She kept one palm flat against the stone each night before she slept, a habit she had developed within the first week of occupancy that nobody suggested she change because it was in the most literal sense exactly correct. The stone was warmest there in the evenings after a full day of absorbing fire heat and sleeping. Close to it was sleeping close to the most effective radiant surface in the structure. She did not know the physics of what she was doing. She knew it was warm and she was not coughing. Henry had taken on the task of recording the thermometer readings in a small notebook he carried in his coat pocket twice a day at minimum, more often when conditions were changing. He was not yet systematic about it in the way a scientist would be systematic, but he was consistent, which at 10 years old and in the middle of Montana winter was more than adequate. The readings built a picture over the first 2 weeks of December that was more persuasive than any argument Elias could have made in words. Interior temperatures ranging from 58 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on fire activity and exterior conditions. All of this achieved with a daily firewood consumption that Elias tracked separately by counting the splits he brought in from the woodpile each morning. The number remained stubbornly, insistently low, a sixth of a cord on average. Less when the sun was out and the south-facing door could be cracked to admit passive solar gain. The valley's log cabins were burning through their stockpiles at a rate that was beginning to concern people. 2 families on the East Bench had already sent men to cut additional wood in the first week of December, which was earlier than anyone had needed to resupply in recent memory, and which meant either that the winter was going to be harder than usual, or that the existing stockpiles had been miscalculated, or both. Elias heard this information from Owen Reeves, who had a practical man's habit of tracking resource consumption the way a farmer tracks rainfall, not obsessively, but consistently, as background data that occasionally turned out to matter. Reeves mentioned it without drawing a comparison to the stone cabin's consumption, because he was the kind of man who let facts speak without editorial assistance. Elias noted it in the same way he noted the thermometer readings as data building its case. The storm warning came on a Tuesday morning from a man named Silas Webb, who ran trap lines in the northern sections of the valley and whose read of the sky had been accurate enough over 15 winters that people paid attention to it the way they paid attention to barometers, which was to say selectively and with private skepticism until the prediction proved out. Webb came through the general store on his way south with a load of pelts in a face that carried the particular alert stillness of someone who has seen something that rewrote his plans for the week. He told the men around the store's central stove what he had seen in the northern sky 2 days earlier: the low cloud formation, the wind behavior shifting in a pattern he had last witnessed as a young man, the quality of silence that preceded the worst weather he had known. "I saw that sky once before," he said. "I was 22. The storm that followed kept me in a line shack for 4 days and killed 6 head of cattle on the Donner property. If this is the same system coming down, you want to be inside with twice the wood you think you need." He finished his transaction and left, and the men around the stove were quiet for a moment, in the way people are quiet when someone has just handed them information that requires a decision. Elias was not in the general store that day. He heard about Webb's warning from Henry, who had been sent on an errand and had the child's instinct for absorbing overheard adult information and carrying it home intact. Elias listened to his son's account, asked 2 questions about the specifics of what Webb had described, and then went out to the woodpile. Not because he was afraid of running short. His consumption rate left him with reserves that would have looked reckless in a log cabin, but were reasonable given what he knew about his walls. He went out because he wanted the data point that a real storm would give him. He had been working from theory verified by mild cold. What he needed to know, completely what he had built, was an extreme. He stacked an additional cord against the east exterior wall under a tarp and spent the rest of the day checking the roof overlap, the smoke hole cap mechanism, and the door seal. Then he waited. The storm arrived on the 19th of December with the indifference of a natural phenomenon that has no awareness of the significance it carries for the people in its path. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 6 hours on the first day. By nightfall, it was 8 below zero and still falling, the wind picking up from the northwest in the pattern Webb had described, not a single sustained push, but a series of gusts that came in intervals, each one probing for weaknesses, the way water probes for cracks and finding them in the log cabins across the valley with a thoroughness that would not be fully understood until the storm passed and the damage was counted. The first day was survivable for everyone. The log cabins burned through wood at a rate above normal, but not yet alarming. Families added logs to fires that had been adequate all fall and found them adequate still, if barely. Children stayed close to the fire. Men made more trips to the woodpile than usual and came back with cold, reddened hands and the particular clenched jaw of men calculating their resources against an unknown duration. Inside the Morrow cabin, the temperature held at 63 degrees, with a fire that Elias kept at a moderate burn, adding wood 3 times across the day, the stone walls absorbing each contribution of heat with the patient steadiness that had characterized them all fall. He checked the smoke hole draft twice and found it pulling cleanly, the conical roof geometry channeling air in the pattern he had designed it to channel. Nothing required adjustment. The second day arrived colder, -7 at dawn, falling to -12 by noon, the wind velocity increasing until the gusts were driving snow horizontal past the doorway in a way that made the door gap the small clearance at the base that provided the cabin's intake air into a channel that pushed cold into the lower 2 inches of floor space. Elias sealed it with a rolled canvas wedge that he had prepared for this possibility, cutting the intake to a narrow slot on the leeward side of the door frame where the wind pressure was lower. The interior temperature dropped 2 degrees over 4 hours, then stabilized. He added a moderate load of wood to the fire and watched the thermometer recover to 61, then 62. It was late on the second night, closer to midnight than to 11, when the knocking came. It was not emphatic knocking. It was the knocking of people who have been in the cold for too long and whose hands have lost enough dexterity that the knocking is less a demand and more a managed effort, each impact against the door costing more than it should. Elias was awake. He had been checking the smoke cap in the rising wind, and he opened the door to find Arthur Pierce and his wife Margaret standing in the snow, with their 2 grandchildren behind them, the children wrapped in every blanket they had managed to carry their faces, showing the flat, glassy expression that cold produces when it has been working on a person long enough to begin reducing them. Margaret was holding the younger child against her coat with both arms. Arthur's lips were gray. Behind them, visible in the gap between gusts, the roofline of the Pierce cabin had collapsed along the ridge. The accumulated snow load from 2 days of continuous fall had found the point where the cedar shakes in the aging ridge beam met at their weakest, and the beam had given, and the roof had come down in the particular slow way of structures failing under distributed weight, not all at once, but in a process that would have begun with a sound and ended with cold pouring in from above. "Come in," Clara said, and she was already moving and already pulling the youngest child toward the wall where the stone radiated warmest, already assessing with her father's clinical precision who needed warmth first and how fast. 6 people in 78 interior square feet. It was not spacious. It required a reorganization of the cabin's furniture that Clara directed with the quiet authority of someone who has decided that sentiment about furniture arrangements is a luxury for warmer situations. The beds were repositioned. The table was moved against the wall. The central space around the fire was cleared to allow circulation rather than occupation. Arthur Pierce sat down on the bench near the east wall and put both hands flat against the stone and did not move for a long time. And the expression on his face was one that Elias found difficult to look at directly, not because it was painful, but because it was completely unguarded, stripped of the social overlay that adults usually maintain. Just a man feeling warmth enter his hands after a sustained period of genuine danger, the relief entirely physical and therefore entirely honest. The cabin held. Through the third day of the blizzard with 6 people inside it, with the temperature outside dropping to 14 below and the wind reaching a sustained velocity that could be heard inside the stone walls as a low, constant harmonic note, the temperature inside never dropped below 58 degrees. Elias kept the fire burning at a level that was by any rational measure modest. He was not roaring it, not burning emergency quantities, not doing anything other than maintaining the cycle he had maintained all winter. The walls did the rest. He recorded every temperature reading in Henry's notebook himself during those 3 days, his handwriting more careful than usual, each entry precise with the time and the exterior conditions as best he could estimate them, through the door crack and the smoke hole behavior. On the morning of the third day, with the storm showing its first signs of exhaustion, the wind dropping from its sustained roar to intermittent gusts, the snow falling now. From simple gravity, rather than being driven horizontal, Elias made the decision that had been building in him since the first night of the blizzard. He let the fire die, not banked, not reduced to coals, and then added to fully extinguished. He waited until the last flames pulled back to nothing and the hearth held only gray ash and the faint orange trace of deep embers, and then he sat down with the notebook and began recording. 1 hour temperature inside fell from 64 to 61 degrees. 3 degrees across 60 minutes with no fire, no additional heat source. 6 people breathing in a confined space 14 below outside. He showed Clara the number. She looked at it for a moment, looked at the cold hearth, and said nothing, which was the most complete response available. 2 hours, 59 degrees. 2 degrees in the second hour. The rate of loss was decelerating rather than accelerating as the differential between the wall temperature and the interior air narrowed, and the radiant output of the walls began to dominate over the conductive loss through the stone to the exterior. This was the behavior the Philadelphia catalog had described in the abstract, the behavior Hoback had pointed to in a Pennsylvania mill, without being able to fully explain why the behavior that Elias had calculated on paper, in the specific mathematical terms of heat capacity and thermal mass, but that he had not been able to be completely certain of until he was sitting in it. The walls were giving back. 4,000 pounds of stone raised over weeks of absorbed fire heat to an average interior surface temperature well above the ambient air were now releasing that energy in the slow, patient way of dense material that received what it was given and held it longer than you deserved. At 3 hours 58 degrees, he added 3 logs to the coals and the temperature recovered to 62 in 40 minutes and stayed there. Arthur Pierce had been awake for this entire period, sitting against the east wall watching. When the 3 logs went in and the temperature climbed back and stabilized, he said something that Elias would think about for a long time afterward, not because it was eloquent, but because it was the words of a practical man who had just seen a thing he could not have fully believed from description alone. The wall is doing the work. The fire just tops it off. Elias handed him the notebook. Pierce looked at the columns of numbers, at the slow rate of decline, at the recovery curve after the 3-log addition, and his face did the thing that faces do when an abstract principle becomes a physical fact, when the theory lands in the body rather than staying in the head. He handed the notebook back without speaking, and both men understood that what had passed between them was more complete than any argument could have been. The storm broke on the 21st, and the valley emerged into the specific silence that follows major weather, a silence that carries information, because it is the silence of people assessing and counting and beginning to understand the gap between what they had and what the storm required. Fences were down across 4 properties. One barn had lost its north wall entirely. The Pierce cabin roof remained as it had ended on the second night, caved along the ridge, the interior exposed to a foot of snow that had entered from above. 2 other families had burned through wood at rates that left their remaining stockpiles in a condition that required immediate conversation about what the rest of the winter would cost them. One family had burned through nearly a cord per day at the height of the storm, which was a number that when Elias heard it from Owen Reeves 3 days after the storm broke, he sat with for a quiet moment, converting it against his own consumption across the same period. He had burned less than a third of a cord across all 3 days, with 6 people inside. Reeves stood outside the cabin in the aftermath, in the particular stillness of a man who has been thinking about something for several days and has arrived at the point where thinking requires a second party to be productive. He looked at the stone wall, at the thin, steady smoke from the chimney, at the absence of any sign of structural distress in the mortar joints or the roof line. Holt is telling people the storm tracked different over your section of the valley, he said, that your location has a natural windbreak advantage the other cabins don't have. The statement hung in the cold air for a moment. Elias pulled the notebook from his coat and opened it to the temperature records. He handed it to Reeves without a word, and Reeves read slowly, his eyes moving down the columns in the way of a man who is not accustomed to reading data tables but is accustomed to reading the things that matter. He stopped at the entry from the 3rd morning, the 3-hour no-fire experiment, the 58-degree floor. He read it twice. How much wood? Elias pointed to the tally at the top right corner of the page. Reeves looked at the number, then looked back at his own cabin in the middle distance. smoke pouring in thick, dark columns from the chimney, his wife inside feeding a fire that would burn through the rest of the morning just to hold 45 degrees. "I burned 2 full cords," he said. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man doing arithmetic whose conclusion he has not yet decided how to feel about. "Your walls are logs. Logs insulate, but they give nothing back. When the fire drops, the warmth leaves with it because there is nothing holding it." Reeves handed the notebook back. He touched the exterior stone wall once briefly with his gloved hand, and then looked at it with the focused attention of a man who was revising a document he thought was already finished. The day that changed everything in the way that the specific and undeniable changes, things not dramatically, not with any ceremony, but with the quiet finality of a door closing on a previous arrangement, began at dusk on a Thursday in early January. The temperature had dropped back to 8 below after a week of relative moderation, and the valley had returned to its winter routines with the subdued energy of people who have recently been tested and are still absorbing the results. Elias was inside the fire at coals, the interior holding 64 degrees without requiring his attention for the next several hours. He was oiling a set of stone chisels that needed sharpening for the spring work he was already planning in his head. There was a sound at the door. Not knocking, exactly, more like the presence of someone standing close enough to be heard through stone, the particular quality of air at a threshold that changes when a person occupies it. Elias opened the door, and Franklin Holt was standing in the last gray light of the winter evening, alone, without the company of other builders or the protection of a public context, just a man by himself in the cold, his collar up against the wind, his hands in his pockets, looking at Elias with an expression that had dropped most of its usual management. He had walked to this door. He had done it without announcing himself, without bringing witnesses, without the cover of any professional framing. The walk itself was the thing it was most important to see. "How warm is it in there?" Holt's voice was flat, in the way of a man who has spent considerable time arriving at a simple question and wants a simple answer. Elias stepped back from the doorway. The thermometer on the east wall was visible from the entrance. Holt looked at it for a long moment before stepping inside, and then he looked at the coals in the hearth, and then he turned in a slow, deliberate arc, looking at every section of the curved wall, and his face in the warm interior light of a cabin, holding 64 degrees on an 8 below night, had on it the expression of a man who has been shown the answer to a question he knew well enough to understand what the answer meant. He crossed to the wall and pressed both palms flat against the stone. He stood there with his eyes closed, and the only sound in the cabin was the very low, very steady tick of thermal mass doing exactly what physics said it would do, releasing, radiating, holding against the night. Holt kept his palms against the stone for longer than any structural assessment required. It was not an assessment anymore. The professional frame he had carried to the door, the builder arriving to evaluate, to understand, to extract applicable knowledge, had not survived contact with the wall's warmth, which was not the sharp, radiant heat of a fire, but something older and more patient, the stored remnant of days of careful burning, released now in the slow, even way of material that has no urgency because it has mass enough to afford the luxury of being gradual. His eyes were closed, his breathing had settled. Something that had been held in the set of his shoulders for the last several months was releasing with the same unhurried quality as the heat itself. Elias let him stand there. He went back to his chisels, the methodical task of oiling each one along the full length of the blade. Not because the chisels required urgent attention, but because a man who has just walked a long internal distance deserves to arrive at his own pace without being watched. Clara appeared briefly in the interior doorway, assessed the situation with one glance, and withdrew. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a coherent bed of coals that pulsed faintly in the draft from the door still slightly open at Holt's back. The thermometer read 64. When Holt finally turned the question he asked was not the one Elias had anticipated, which would have been about the temperature differential or the firewood consumption or the structural performance of the conical roof under the blizzard snow load. Instead, he asked about the mortar. Not the failure in November, not the repaired joints, but the formula. How had Elias arrived at the specific lime-to-sand ratio that held through the 40-degree swing of the blizzard period without a single additional failure? It was the most precise question possible, and it was the question of a man who already knew the answer and wanted to understand how Elias had gotten there. Elias set down the chisel he was working and looked at Holt steadily. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, which was hanging on the peg near the door, and took out the folded paper. He set it on the table between them without speaking, and Holt looked at it the way a man looks at something he placed somewhere specific and finds exactly where he left it with the recognition of authorship. Neither man spoke for a moment. The paper lay between them in the warm interior light with all the weight of everything it represented, which was not only a mortar formula, but the catalog, and the catalog was not only a catalog, but the decision Holt had made 4 years earlier to read it and put it back on the shelf. And that decision was not only a professional calculation, but a choice made at the expense of 20 families who had spent 4 subsequent winters burning 12 to 15 cords each in cabins that could have been better. I couldn't say it in front of them. Holt's voice carried the flatness of a man who has examined his own reasoning from every available angle and found that it holds together technically while failing in every way that actually matters. 15 years of cabins, every one of them rectangular. If I told them you were right, I was telling them I had been building wrong. Elias folded the paper and slid it back across the table toward Holt. You left the note. Holt looked at the folded paper. He did not pick it up. Leaving a note in the dark is easier than standing in the light and saying a thing. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two men who have each been honest about something they would rather not have been honest about, and who recognize in each other the effort that honesty required. The technical questions came after that, and they were many, and Elias answered every one of them with the precision of a man who has thought through each aspect of his design from multiple directions and welcomes the examination. Because examination is how a thing gets understood deeply enough to be replicated correctly. They talked about foundation depth relative to frost line and about the relationship between wall thickness and the interior diameter in terms of optimal mass-to-space ratio, about the chimney placement at a true center, and what it contributed to the convection pattern, about the specific conical roof angle that shed snow load without creating the ice damming that would eventually crack a flatter profile. Holt took no notes during this conversation, but he listened with the total body attention of someone recording through memory rather than paper, the way a craftsman in the field listens when he knows the information is load-bearing. At one point, Holt walked to the interior wall and pressed his palm against it again, this time moving along the curve in a slow circuit, stopping at intervals, feeling the temperature variations that corresponded to the fire's relationship to each section of the wall. He paused at the north section and looked at the joints Elias had repacked with the notes formula, running one finger along the surface. The repair was invisible. The joint was flush and smooth, and showed none of the faint irregularity that distinguishes patched work from original work when a man who knows what he is looking for gives it his full attention. He did not comment. The quality of the repair was its own comment. Near the end of the evening, when the fire had been built back up with 3 logs and the interior had climbed to 67 degrees and Holt had been in the cabin for nearly 2 hours, he said the thing that Elias had not expected him to say, not because it was unlikely, but because the directness of it cut across the careful technical framing they had been working in. I was wrong about 3 things. Holt said, his voice carrying the even tone of a man reading from a prepared list, which in a sense he was a list he had been preparing in his own mind for the duration of the worst storm Bitterroot Valley had seen in 10 years. I said it would collapse. It didn't. I said it would consume wood at a rate that would bankrupt you by February. It's consuming 1/3 of what my cabins use. I said your family would freeze. They're the warmest household in the valley. Elias was quiet for a moment. I know what you said. Holt met his eyes. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. The deliberateness of the repetition was the point. He had said those things in public loudly and with authority, and the correction needed to be made with equivalent clarity in an equivalent direction. That was the logic of it, and both men understood the logic. What neither of them said that evening, and what Elias would not fully understand until later, was that Holt had already decided what he was going to do before he knocked on the door. He had decided it during the blizzard on the second night when the temperature in his own cabin had dropped to 38 degrees, and he had sat wrapped in 2 coats in the center of his living space, listening to the wind find every seam in his log walls burning through wood at a rate that turned his winter stockpile into a subtraction problem whose answer was going to be uncomfortable. He had sat there and thought about the thermometer on the east wall of the Morrow cabin which he had seen on his October visit and whose existence had bothered him in the specific way that accurate measurement bothers a man who has been operating on approximation. At 38 degrees in his own cabin, with the fire pushed hard, he had done the arithmetic one final time. And when it finished, he had put the arithmetic away and thought about what a man does when the arithmetic is done, and the answer is the answer. The following Saturday, the general store was full by mid-morning, in the way it was always full on Saturdays, in wintermen who had been isolated on their properties through the week coming in for supplies and for the social metabolism of a small community that required periodic aggregation to function. There were 12 or 14 men in the main room when Franklin Holt walked in, more than enough for the purpose, fewer than would have made the moment performative rather than practical. He bought what he had come to buy, conducted the transaction, and then turned to the room with the deliberate ease of a man who has prepared for something and is now simply executing it. He had been the senior builder in this valley for 15 years. He understood how information moved through small communities and what it required to move accurately. He had put bad information into this room in the fall, and he had come to put accurate information in its place. I told most of you that the Morrow cabin would fail structurally, he said. His voice was the voice he used on job sites, clear, specific, stripped of both aggression and apology, on the voice of professional accounting. It didn't. I told you it would burn through wood at a rate that proved the design impractical. It burns a third of what a comparable log cabin requires. I told you the family would struggle to stay warm. They maintained 60-plus degrees through the worst storm in 10 years, with 4 guests inside, and a fire that would have been inadequate in any cabin I have ever built. He paused for a fraction of a second that was not hesitation but emphasis. I was wrong on every count. If anyone in this room wants to build one, come see me Monday. He picked up his supplies and left. Henry Morrow was standing near the dry goods shelf when Holt said it. He had been sent to the store for salt and had arrived early enough to find a good position near the middle shelf where he could see most of the room. He was old enough to understand what he was hearing and young enough to feel it in his chest in a way that adults had mostly learned to suppress, the particular physical sensation of a vindication that arrives not for yourself, but for someone you love. He stood very still through the whole thing, and when Holt left, and the room filled with the complex conversational noise of men processing a significant revision. Henry paid for the salt with the money his mother had given him and walked home through the snow at a pace slightly faster than normal, holding the information carefully, the way you hold something fragile until you can put it down somewhere safe. He found his father in the yard checking the woodpile tarp, and without preamble, without any of the usual circling that children do around important information, he described exactly what he had heard and seen, including the specific words in the specific order they had been spoken, because he had fixed them in his memory the way he fixed thermometer readings in his notebook, as data that required precision to be useful. Elias listened without expression. He tied the tarp corner he had been working on and straightened up and looked at his son's face, which still had something moving through it that had not finished settling. How did the room respond? Henry thought about this carefully, which Elias appreciated. Some of them looked like they'd already figured it out. A couple looked like they were adding numbers they didn't want to add. Old Doyle looked at the floor. Elias considered this for a moment, then good. He went back inside, and Henry stood in the yard for another moment in the cold understanding that the word had meant something specific, but not yet knowing precisely what. 3 families came to Holt in the following week. He came to Elias for the detailed specifications before he met with any of them, and Elias gave them freely foundation depth mortar ratios, including the notes formula, which he had now standardized and could explain in full, the calculations for chimney placement, relative to interior diameter, the roof pitch that managed snow load and draft simultaneously. He gave Holt the Philadelphia Engineering Catalog on loan. Holt returned it 2 days later with small pencil notes in the margins at the sections on thermal capacity calculations, precise and tidy marks that showed he was not reading for the first time, but refining what he already knew against the new context of a structure that had actually been built and tested. He returned the catalog without commenting on the margin notes, and Elias kept the catalog with the margin notes intact because they were in their way, a record of something. The Pierce family was the first to commission a new cabin. Arthur Pierce had spent the remainder of the winter in a room at the back of his son's property, while the ridge beam of his original cabin was cleared and assessed for repair, and by February he had decided that repair was the wrong direction and rebuilding was the right one. He came to Elias first, not to Holt, and they stood in the snow together, looking at the site and talking about dimensions and orientation and the direction of prevailing wind relative to where the door should face. And when Elias asked him what had decided him, Pierce pressed both hands flat against the outside of the Morrow cabin's stone wall, the way he had pressed his palms against the inside on the second night of the blizzard, and said nothing because there was nothing to add. The couple from Ohio arrived in April, a young man named Daniel Webb, no relation to the trapper, and his wife Ruth, who had come west with the specific intention of starting right rather than starting over. They had heard the stories before their wagon reached the valley, which was how thoroughly the winter's events had sorted themselves into a narrative that traveled. Ruth Webb asked Clara every question that the women in the valley had been too proud to ask the previous fall: how you organized a curved interior space, how you kept the children's area distinct from the cooking area without the right angles that partitioned a rectangular cabin into its functions, how you felt in winter about the smaller footprint. Clara answered each question with the directness of someone who had lived the answers rather than theorized them. You stop missing corners about 2 weeks in, Clara said. What you don't stop is noticing that your floor is warm. Ruth looked at the floor under her feet, stone-paved warm from the radiant wall heat, not the cold through the boards experience she had known in every winter dwelling of her previous life. And the look on her face was the look of a person revising a definition they have held since childhood. The Webb cabin went up at 14 feet diameter, 2 feet wider than the Morrow cabin, reflecting the lesson that the Morrow design had encoded: start at the size the family needs, rather than the minimum survivable size. Holt built it with 2 apprentices who were learning the round foundation work for the first time, and the process of teaching it forced a precision of articulation about the structural principles that proved useful. The things you can do without explaining while you do them alone become the things you must be able to explain when someone else needs to replicate them. By the end of the Webb build, both apprentices understood the compression geometry of a closed curve well enough to have a technical conversation about it, which meant the knowledge had passed another generation. Owen Reeves built 2 connected circles sharing a central wall and a single chimney, a figure-8 layout that gave him 2 distinct thermal zones from one heating system. He had worked it out on paper over the winter, sitting with the engineering catalog after Elias had loaned it to him for a week, and the design had the particular elegance of a solution that uses the constraints of the system as its primary advantage rather than fighting them. 2 small round cabins linked at a shared wall meant 2 heated zones that could be open to each other or separated depending on need, and the shared chimney cut the masonry cost, while the connected mass of both walls meant that each zone benefited from the thermal storage of both structures. When Holt saw the plans, he was quiet for a long moment, in the way he was quiet when he was processing something worth processing. "That's better than anything I would have designed," he said. Reeves shrugged with the modest discomfort of a man unaccustomed to praise. "I just followed the principle further than the first example." Walt Taggart came to Elias alone on a morning in late April without announcement. He walked to the property and stood at the gate in the familiar posture of a man who has decided to do something he has been resisting for a while and is committed to it now but not comfortable with it. He had called the design suicide in October, which was a strong word that could not be entirely walked back regardless of what the winter had demonstrated, and Taggart was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said and lived with the consequences. He did not offer an apology, and Elias did not expect one. What Taggart offered instead was a specific technical question. How high did the conical roof need to be at the peak to achieve adequate draft without creating the flat profile that would accumulate ice at the eave line? It was a precise and sensible question, and it suggested that he had been thinking about the problem seriously rather than casually. Elias answered it with the same complete attention he had given to every other person who had asked him something in good faith, and the 2 men stood in the April sun and talked about pitch angles and snow behavior and draft mechanics for the better part of an hour, and neither of them mentioned October at all, and this was in its way the most mature conversation either of them had in the entire span of the story. The spring of 1880 was warm and early, which gave the builders working on round stone foundations good curing conditions and enough time before the next season to complete roofs without the pressure of racing the frost. By the end of May, there were 3 new stone circle cabins in Bitterroot Valley in various stages of completion, with 2 more contracted for summer builds. The knowledge had moved the way practical knowledge moves in small communities, not through formal instruction, but through observation and conversation, and the specific transfer that happens when one man watches another man work and asks questions at the right moments and takes the answer seriously. Holt was teaching it as he built it, which was the most effective form of instruction available for work that lived primarily in the hands. It was in this period of productive expansion when the design had passed from experiment to proven method and was building its own momentum in the valley that Arthur Crane arrived. He came in late April on the stage from Helena, a lean man in his middle 40s with the careful grooming of someone who works in an office and understands that appearance carries information in professional contexts. He carried a leather document case and wore a coat that was too light for Montana weather, which suggested he had not planned to stay long. He was a representative of a construction firm based in St. Louis that was extending its operations westward along the rail lines, acquiring rights to building methods that had demonstrated market advantage in specific regional conditions. He had heard about the stone circle cabins through a Helena-based timber merchant who had visited the valley the previous December and had written a letter to an associate in St. Louis describing what he had seen: the round cabin standing calm in the blizzard while the rectangular structures around it struggled. Crane had read the letter, asked several further questions, and gotten on the stage. He found Elias through Holt, who directed him to the Morrow property with the neutral face of a man who has been asked for information and provided it without editorializing about what the visitor intended. Crane introduced himself with the direct professional manner of a man who has made this kind of approach before and has learned to be transparent about his purpose rather than circling around it, because transparency closes deals faster than strategy in environments where people can read strategy without effort. He explained the firm's interest clearly: the financial offer precisely $400 for the exclusive licensing rights to the design, after which anyone building a stone circle cabin in the territories would pay a fee to the firm. He framed it as fair market recognition for a design innovation that had demonstrated real value, which in the abstract was a reasonable framing. Elias did not respond immediately. He listened to the complete offer without interruption, which was characteristic. He did not respond to things while they were still being said, because a response to a partial thing was always incomplete. When Crane finished, Elias asked one question: "If I sell you the rights, what happens when the Pierce family wants to build their next one?" Crane's expression carried the slight adjustment of a man recalibrating for a question he has not anticipated. He offered an exemption provision. Existing valley residents could be grandfathered at reduced cost. Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at the exterior of his cabin at the riverstone that had come from the riverbed half a mile south at the lime mortar that had been mixed by hand in a valley that had all the raw materials anyone needed to build one of these structures for the cost of labor and time and the willingness to learn. "The materials cost nothing," Elias said. "The knowledge costs nothing. The principle is 2,000 years old. I don't see what I would be selling you." Crane adjusted his approach. He explained that what was being sold was not the principle, but the specific validated application, the proven design parameters, the wall thickness ratios, the mortar formula, the roof specifications that had been field tested through an extreme winter. This was a more sophisticated argument, and Elias acknowledged it as such. He went inside that evening and told Clara the full content of the offer, including Crane's best revision of it, which had moved the price to $450 and included a provision for Elias to be named as the design's originator in all licensed materials. Clara listened in the way she listened to the things that required her full attention, and when he finished, she was quiet for longer than the pause that preceded a simple opinion. The money was real. $450 would purchase the additional land parcel to the east of their property that would allow them to expand the kitchen garden to a size that made commercial sense, would buy Henry the school books he needed for the advanced instruction. He had outgrown the valley's limited supply of wood, put a reserve against the kind of emergency that came without warning in a place where emergencies were routine. She was not dismissive of the number. She laid it on the table between them as what it was, which was a significant thing. "What does it cost?" Elias looked at his hands. Arthur Pierce could afford to build with Holt's help and the formula because all of it was free. If Crane buys the rights, Pierce's next cabin costs money that Pierce may not have. Clara turned this over in the way she turned things that were not simple. What about the families who haven't built yet, the ones who lose a child to a cold floor next winter because they couldn't afford the fee? Elias looked at her. That's the answer, he said. That was the answer before I asked you. Clara picked up the lamp and took it to the back room, and the conversation was complete. He met Crane the following morning and declined the offer. He did not do it with a speech or a justification that required Crane to agree with it. He said that the design was available to anyone who wanted to learn it, that the knowledge would be shared freely, that he had no interest in being the toll keeper on a road that ought to have no toll. Crane received this with the professional equanimity of a man who has heard many declines and has learned to read them for finality, and this one had the quality of finality. He tried once more, raising the offer to 500 and framing it differently. The firm would not restrict access for individuals, only for commercial builders. Elias looked at him with the patient attention of a man who has already made his decision and is waiting for the other man to find the edge of it. Any builder who learns this technique and uses it to help someone stay warm is doing what building is for, Elias said. I won't charge him for that. Crane left on the afternoon stage with his document case and his too-light coat, and the valley absorbed his departure without ceremony. Elias told no one about the offer for several months. When he eventually mentioned it to Holt during one of their now regular conversations about an upcoming build, Holt was quiet for a long moment, in the way that had come to mean he was experiencing something he had not anticipated and was deciding how to metabolize it. $500, Holt said finally, not as a question, as a fact being examined. Yes, Holt looked at the foundation they were standing on, then at the rising walls around them. You know what $500 would have done for my family when I first came out here? Elias handed him the level. I know what the Pierce family's next cabin is going to cost them, he said. Holt took the level and checked the course they had been laying and said nothing more, but the silence had a quality to it that was different from the silences they had shared in the early months. It was the silence of two men who have arrived at the same point by different paths and recognized each other there. By the winter of 1881, there were 12 stone circle cabins in Bitterroot Valley. The number was not uniform in its specifics. Some were larger, some had the figure-8 connection that Reeves had pioneered. One family had added an interior stone partition to create a distinct sleeping area, separated from the main living space, while preserving the thermal continuity of the outer wall. But the core principle held constant across all of them, because the core principle was not a stylistic preference, but a physics statement, and physics statements do not bend to individual variation. Dense stone mass, circular geometry, central heat, conical roof. Everything else was adaptation. The data that accumulated over that second winter removed any remaining room for debate, which meant that by the third winter, the debate had simply stopped, replaced by a practical consensus that expressed itself not in argument but in behavior. The number of rectangular log cabins built in the valley declined. The number of stone circle cabins increased, and the aggregate firewood consumption of the community dropped in a pattern that was visible in the timber merchants' records, in the reduced demand for split wood at the general store, in the absence of the early season resupply emergency runs that had characterized every winter of the previous decade. Families in stone circle cabins burned an average of 5 to 6 cords per season. Families in log cabins burned 12 to 15. The stone cabins required no chinking replacement, no corner joint resealing, no log treatment against the rot that worked through the base courses of wooden structures over time. The maintenance differential across 10 years was as significant as the fuel differential across one winter, but it was a slower kind of proof and therefore a quieter kind of persuasion. Franklin Holt built 17 stone circle cabins before he retired from active building. He built them with the same systematic attention he had brought to rectangular construction for 15 years, applying the new principle with the competence of a craftsman who does not need to be convinced of a method's value once the evidence is in, only to understand it well enough to execute it correctly. He became, over the course of those 17 builds, arguably more technically precise in the stone circle method than Elias himself, because teaching a thing repeatedly to different apprentices with different levels of prior knowledge forces a precision of understanding that a man working alone for his own purposes never fully develops. He could explain the thermal mass calculations from first principles to a man who had never heard of specific heat capacity. He could describe the compression geometry of a closed curve to a carpenter trained in right angles and have the carpenter understand it by the end of the conversation. He had, in the years since January, become the method's most effective advocate, which was a transformation that Elias observed without comment, and with the particular satisfaction of a man who has watched something he built outlast the argument against it. In the summer of 1883, a journalist from the Helena Herald arrived in Bitterroot Valley to write about what several correspondents had described to him as an unusual architectural trend. He had letters in his pocket from sources who had used phrases like radically efficient and structurally unlike anything built previously in the territories. And he had a professional writer's interest in the human story behind the material fact who had started this, what had driven the choice, what the community had made of it when it first appeared. He was told that the man who had built the first one was a stonemason named Elias Morrow, and he went to the Morrow property on a Tuesday morning with his notebook open. Elias met him at the gate. He listened to the journalist's introduction, understood the purpose of the visit completely, and gave him a single sentence. Franklin Holt has built 17 of them. He can tell you more than I can about how it works at scale. The journalist, whose name was Graham and who was accustomed to subjects who wanted to be written about rather than subjects who redirected him, stood at the gate for a moment recalibrating. You built the first one, Graham said. I built one, Elias said. Holt built 17. Graham looked at the stone cabin behind Elias at its settled permanence, at the mortar joints that had been in place for 4 years, without visible deterioration, at the conical roof that had shed snow through 3 major winters, without incident. He wrote down what Elias had said and went to find Holt. The article ran in the Helena Herald in September 1883. It described the stone circle cabins of Bitterroot Valley as an architectural innovation of significant regional value, noted their thermal performance in specific measurable terms, quoted Franklin Holt at length on the structural and engineering principles, and attributed the origin of the method to a Pennsylvania stonemason who arrived in the valley in the mid-1870s, without naming Elias directly. Holt had told the story accurately, giving Elias full credit in his account, but the credit had been transformed by the journalist's framing into the kind of background attribution that fills in context without carrying the weight of a named individual. Elias read the article at the breakfast table on the morning Clara brought it back from the general store and read it carefully from beginning to end and folded it in half and set it beside his coffee cup. Henry was across the table watching his father's face with the focused attention he had developed over years of reading the information that moved through his father's expression in the narrow channels available to a man who did not perform his emotional states. He saw the reading and the folding and the pause. It doesn't have your name in it, Henry said. Elias looked at his son, who was 13 now, and would be going to a better school in Helena in the fall, the school that Clara had arranged with the money saved by burning a third of what the valley's log cabin families burned. Does this cabin have my name on it? Henry considered this. He looked at the walls around him, at the curved stone interior that had been warm under his palm for 4 years, at the thermometer that still hung on the east wall and that still gave its accurate reading every morning, that he recorded in notebooks that were now stacked 3 high in the cabinet by the door. No, Henry said. Elias picked up his coffee. Then we have what we need. The sentence landed quietly and stayed in the room after he said it, the way certain sentences do. The snow came early that October, earlier than any October in recent memory, and the valley received it with the calm of people who have been living in structures designed for exactly this. No emergency wood runs. No pre-dawn fire management. No families calculating whether their stockpile would outlast the season. The chimneys of the stone circle cabins exhaled their thin, pale smoke into the cold morning air with the unhurried steadiness that Owen Reeves had noticed on the morning after the first great storm 4 years earlier, when he had stopped in the snow and stared at the single column rising from the round structure and felt something that he had not yet had the vocabulary to articulate, which was the presence of a problem that had been solved. The Pierce cabin was finished by September, built on the ruins of the collapsed 114 feet across, with walls that Arthur had helped lay himself under, Holt's instruction, his hands learning the weight and feel of the right stones in the weeks before the first hard freeze arrived. Margaret Pierce had organized her interior with the practical ingenuity she had observed in Clara's space. The curved shelves, the beds against the warmest sections of wall, the central clear path that a round space provides without requiring any furniture to enforce it. On the first genuinely cold night of that October, she pressed one hand against the stone wall before she slept the way her husband had done on the night the storm had driven them to a neighbor's door, and the wall was warm, and she held her hand against it for a long moment in the dark, receiving what it offered, which was not remarkable in any way that could be written down, and was entirely remarkable in the way that it felt. Elias stood outside his cabin on the same October evening, watching the valley settle into its winter preparations with the changed metabolism of a community that no longer needed to brace in the same way for the same costs. Nora was inside at the table, her breathing easy, her chest clear, working through a mathematics problem in the lamplight. Henry was stacking split wood against the east wall under the tarp, the same task he had first helped with when he was 10 years old, and the task had been part of an experiment that no one but his father was certain would succeed. Clara was at the door, her shawl pulled close, watching the last of the light leave the eastern ridgeline. "You're not going in," she said. It was not a question. Elias was looking at the valley, at the small columns of smoke rising from the stone circle cabins, scattered across it, at the absence of the frantic quality that had characterized those chimneys in the winters before the thick, urgent gray of fires burning too hard against too much cold. "Counting chimneys," he said. Clara stood beside him and looked at the same valley. The light was almost gone, and the stone wall at his back was radiating the warmth of a full day's absorbed heat, steady and patient and sufficient, the way things are that were built with enough mass to hold what they receive. "How many?" she asked. He looked along the valley floor at the rounded shapes visible in the last light, at the smoke columns rising clean and unhurried into the cold air above them. "Enough," he said. The word was a complete answer, carrying in its single syllable everything that the calculations and the arguments in the long Montana winter, and the crack in the mortar, and the note left in the dark, and the man who sat in a freezing cabin in a storm, and finally stopped resisting, what he had always known, all of it compressed into the one word that said, "The thing works, the thing holds, the thing is doing what it was built to do," and the rest of it, the credit and the arguments and the articles and the offers, the rest of it was weather, and the stone outlasted weather, and that was enough. Years later, when Henry Morrow was a grown man teaching his own children about the winter, his father had built the stone cabin. He would write the account down in a journal that his daughter would find in a box after his death and read carefully from beginning to end. The last line of the account was the line that everyone who read the journal later remembered, not because it was eloquent in the way of practiced writers, but because it had the specific accuracy of a man who had watched something real happen from close enough to see it clearly and far enough away to understand what it meant. He wrote, "My father did not invent anything. He remembered what others had forgotten, and he trusted what he remembered when it would have been easier to doubt it, and he built it with his hands, and it held."